May the Lord be with you. This is Pastor Ryan Stout over here at St. Peter's Lutheran. As you can see, we are all set up for Lent behind us. And this video is part of our CliffsNotes Confirmation series. The intention is that if there is a family with a youth in confirmation class who can't make it to our usual group reading and discussion on the first and third Sunday of a given month, these videos will help people catch up, right? You can watch them at home, and it won't be the same as the usual full hour that we have together with our confirmation families, but at least it will prevent us from falling too far behind, keeping everyone in the class on the same page. Or maybe you don't have a youth in confirmation, you just would like a companion, you would like to walk with us through our tour of the First Testament or the Old Testament, both the Hebrew Bible and hopefully we'll get to the Greek books of the First Testament by the time we get to the end of the semester. We're about 2/3 of the way through now. This video is for lessons 19 and 20 out of 30. So hopefully you've been enjoying the academic year so far, and if you're not, don't worry, the end is in sight. Victory is at hand. Okay, for a little bit of recap. We have been progressing more or less chronologically through the story of the Hebrew Bible. We started off with the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which gave us sort of the mythic beginnings, the foundations of the Israelite, the Hebrew worldview, and introduced us to the great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, leading to the 12 tribes of Israel. We talked about Moses and the exile when the nation that grew out of Abraham's family was liberated from slavery in Egypt and brought into the promised land where God said that through them, through the Israelite nation, he would bless all the families of the earth. So after those 5 books of Moses, we went to Joshua, who was Moses' successor, his right-hand man who actually led the Israelites into the promised land. We talked about Judges, which covers the period when the 12 tribes lived in a sort of loose confederation, and whenever they turned from God, they would have trouble with their neighbors, and whenever they had trouble with their neighbors, God would raise up an unlikely hero, a judge, to deliver them and return them to the promises of his covenant mercies. After Joshua and Judges, we went to Ruth, which was a beautiful story that talked about how, our neighbors aren't always our enemies. Sometimes they are our grandmother. And from there, we went into the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Samuel being not only the inheritor of the priestly house of Eli, who took care of the Ark of the Covenant, but also universally recognized as the last of the judges who anointed the first of the kings. The era of Samuel bridges the era between judges and kings. And the first 3 kings that Samuel anointed, he anointed Saul and then David. And last time we talked about David's checkered past, the highest of highs and lowest of lows, and took it all the way to his eventual tragic death and the succession of his son Solomon, one of the sons who survived, as you recall. So 1st and 2nd Samuel leads into 1st and 2nd Kings, which we're covering today. And by the by, the reason that some of these biblical books have, 1st Kings, 2nd Kings, 1st Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, 1st Samuel, 2nd Samuel, it's because, well, to be honest, a sheepskin is only so large, right? It's not like somebody wrote 1st Kings and then decided to write a sequel later. It's that if you're writing on vellum, sheepskin or calfskin, you can only fill up so much before you need a new scroll, a new skin. And so really, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they are one work. Okay? Now then, all of that said, lesson 1, Kingdom Divided, 1st Kings. We start off with 1st Kings chapter 4, verses 29 to 34, where we are introduced to Solomon's wisdom. David was known as a faithful, violent man. He was known for his sword. Solomon is known for his wisdom. If his father was a man of war, Solomon is a man of peace. That's why God permitted him to build the temple in Jerusalem, which God would not allow David to build, even though David planned it. We can read there in chapter 4, verses 29 through 34, the breadth of Solomon's knowledge. According to tradition and legend, there are at least 3 books in the Bible attributed to Solomon, claiming him as the author. Song of Songs, the Book of Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And the sort of running gag is that Solomon wrote Song of Songs in his 20s, because Song of Songs is all about romance and the excitement of youth. He's feeling vigorous in that one. Wrote Proverbs in his 40s. Proverbs is all about sort of day-to-day wisdom, living a good life, living a true life. And then Ecclesiastes in his 60s. Ecclesiastes is wonderfully cynical. Now, whether or not Solomon actually wrote any of those, I don't know. But putting them together like that, 20s, 40s, 60s, is not a bad way to remember their emphases, I think. But anyway, moving on. In 1 Kings 7, verses 13 to 14, we read about Solomon's alliances. Again, he was a man of peace. He was a man of trade. He was a man of the mind. And one of his greatest and earliest alliances was with King Hiram of Tyre. What makes this so remarkable? Well, first up, Tyre has things that Israel does not. Tyre is a Phoenician nation. The Phoenicians were Canaanites who became really good seafarers. They've got boats, they've got ships, they've got the know-how to use them, and that's what Solomon needs from them. Also, they have these great cedars that he needs for his major building projects. So the alliance of King Solomon of Israel and King Hiram of Tyre sort of goes down in history as one of the great alliances of the Bible and the ancient Near East. But of course, Tyre, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, these are the enemies of Israel. These were the ones that Joshua had to drive out and that the judges had to fight against. And clearly, we've come to a new era when old enemies are now close allies, bosom friends. And my, but they do accomplish a lot together. Okay, moving on to perhaps Solomon's other most famous alliance. 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 through 14, we meet the Queen of Sheba. Sheba, if I recall correctly, was a nation down on the southwest tip of the Arabian Peninsula. It kind of bridged the gap between what we would consider the Middle East and Africa. And Sheba had a monopoly on frankincense, a wonderful incense that pagans and Jews alike used to worship deity. It's actually the resin from a certain pine tree. Smells amazing. Walk into any old cathedral in a major city anywhere in the United States or Europe and you will smell frankincense deep in the wood. Well, that's where the Queen of Sheba's money came from. Frankincense and trade. Again, she had ships. And she goes to see if Solomon really is a worthy ally, a worthy partner. And as we can read there again in chapter 10, verses 1 through 14, she is impressed by what she sees. And Solomon forms an alliance with the Queen of Sheba. According to legend, it's a bit of an intimate relationship. There is a later dynasty of kings which claims descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This also leads to the Black Jews of Ethiopia, an African nation which claims descent from Solomon and has inherited the promises and the traditions of Israel, and they will play a big role in later parts of the Bible to come. Right? There's an Ethiopian eunuch famously in the New Testament. It's one of the first to be baptized by the apostles. Oh, okay. But Solomon, as he gets older, he takes the whole alliance thing a little too far, and those amorous relationships hinted at in the Song of Songs and the Queen of Sheba, that goes overboard too. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, we learn that Solomon had so many alliances that were cemented in marriage that the man had 1,000 wives and concubines, 1,000. romantic, intimate partners. Of course, many of those were purely political, purely to cement alliances with such and such a power, including the Egyptians. I mean, Solomon is really with Hiram of Tyre and the Queen of Sheba on his side. Solomon stands at the nexus of the three great continents of the ancient world, which were, of course, Europe and Asia and Africa. This is why Israel has always sort of punched above its weight class. It's because they're positioned at the crossroads of civilizations, the trade routes connecting Europe and Asia and Africa, like the great petals of a flower, with Jerusalem right there in the heart of the bloom. Anyway, all of these wives, Solomon indulges their religious traditions. He builds basically pagan temples, pagan sanctuaries all over. This from a man who, according to the book of Kings, has spoken to God face to face twice, who's seen amazing wonders when the temple was consecrated. Even so, in his old age, Solomon, the wisest of men, behaves very, very foolishly, and it is because of his sins, the infidelities of his mature years, that God warns this will cause much of your rule to be taken from you. So even at the height of his influence, his wealth, his power, under Solomon, Israel is probably the most influential, the strongest, the wealthiest that it had ever been or would ever be. Even so, there at the height of Solomon's glory are the seeds of his downfall. Hubris, the Greeks would have loved it. So this wicked little seed comes to fruition in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 20, where we have the northern secession, which occurs in 922 BC. Long story, marginally shorter. Solomon appears to favor his home tribe of Judah over the other 11 tribes of Israel. And these great works of Solomon's take a lot of taxes, take a lot of more or less forced labor. And so when Solomon's son Rehoboam inherits the kingdom, he inherits very unhappy people, and they basically say to him, look, you got to treat us better than your dad did, or we're out of here. So Rehoboam asks his counselors, how should I respond to this? These cranky, quasi-rebellious subjects of mine. And the old men in his court say, be gentle with them, be wiser than your father Solomon, right? Catch more flies with honey than vinegar, as it were. But the young men in his court say, no, tell him that if Solomon was tough, you'll be 10 times tougher. Don't take no guff from them. And Rehoboam, being young and foolish, follows the advice of his firebrand friends, the companions of his youth, and this results in 10 of the 12 tribes breaking away and going off and forming their own country. So from now on, the kingdom of Israel will be split north and south. The south will be named after Judah, the largest tribe in the south, and the north will be named Ephraim, after the largest tribe in the north. It can get a little confusing because often Ephraim is just called Israel. So Israel is both the name for the United Kingdom and it's the name for the northern half after they break away. I usually try to just call the northern kingdom either Ephraim or the north to differentiate it from the United Kingdom of Israel. So, I mean, the good news is Judah in the south still has the Davidic king and still has the temple. Most of the Levites, not all of them, but most of them stick with the south because that's where the temple is. One of the tribes, I believe, was it Benjamin and Simeon, I think, stay with Judah, and Simeon, I think, ends up getting absorbed. Regardless, from now on, there are 2 Israelite nations. The north will have many dynasties. They will rise and fall and kill each other, and they will flirt with paganism and false syncretistic worship. And the south will too, but to a somewhat lesser degree. The biblical authors make it clear that the south is really bad, but the north is just the worst. So anyway, let us move on now to our second lesson of the day, which will cover the second book of Kings. I'm calling this one North versus South. Okay, so we're going to skip a lot of kings. There are dozens, scores of kings north and south. None of them last very long, especially in the north. When I was an undergrad, I had an Old Testament class where we had to memorize all the kings, north and south, and what they did and when they reigned and who was at the same time as the other guy. Because now, of course, you've got at least two houses going at any given time. But we're going to skip all of that. Just know it was a mess. And we're going to hop ahead to the year 722 BC. We read about the fall of Samaria. Samaria is the capital city of that northern kingdom, the northern kingdom of Ephraim or Israel. Its capital is Samaria, just like Jerusalem is the capital of Judah in the south. Anyway, in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 33, we'll take the whole big chunk. The northern kingdom is destroyed by the mighty and quite vicious Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians do not mess around. They are often credited with being the folks who invented crucifixion, which makes you know how warm and fuzzy they are. They're also known to be, at least in some interpretations I've read, religious extremists, right? They didn't care what god you worshipped as long as the main god was Asher, right? It was the name of their god that gave the Assyrian Empire their greater name, their title. Why did this happen? Well, still in chapter 17, verses 7 through 21, the biblical author of 2 Kings clearly believes it's because the people are not faithful to God's covenant. And one of the things that's always part and parcel of that infidelity is innocent blood. When people turn away from God and His promises and His covenants, innocents always suffer. That's clearly this happens again and again in the Bible. In the end of that chunk in 2 Kings 17 verses 24 to 33, something happens that's going to be important for later, right? Okay, so you've got Kingdom of Israel splits in half, Judah in the south, Ephraim in the north. The Assyrian Empire comes in, conquers the northern kingdom of Ephraim, and it takes all the movers and shakers, anybody who's got two pennies to rub together, and pulls them out of their country and scatters them throughout the lands of the Assyrian Empire, and then takes 5 new groups of other conquered peoples in the empire and imports them into northern Israel. Why? Because the Assyrians believe that this cuts down the possibility of rebellion. You take the natives away, at least any of the natives worth taking, and then you import exiles from other lands. So they don't get along. They don't share a culture or a history or a connection to the land, and therefore they're not going to be able to put up much resistance. And honestly, that works pretty well for the Assyrians. Those 10 northern tribes that get scattered to the winds, they never reform. Like, there are some people descended from those tribes who eventually come back, but as political units, as anything cohesive, those 10 tribes are effectively destroyed. And they're known in the history of Judaism as the lost tribes of Israel. The Assyrians are very thorough. Okay, 2 Kings 18, we'll do verse 13 and verses 19 through 25. Assyria now tries to do the same to the south. They run down to the lower half of the old kingdom of Israel, to the Judah Heights, and they besiege Jerusalem, which is the southern capital. But something happens. In 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 20, and then verses 29 through 37, Jerusalem is miraculously delivered. The biblical author says that 185,000 Assyrians in the army are killed overnight by an angel, which would be obviously quite the slaughter. Interestingly enough, other sources, such as the Egyptians, who are no friends of the Assyrians, the Egyptians also record that the siege was broken because of divine intervention, because of the action of a god. And it's been a while since I've delved into it, but I remember stories of mice chewing through bowstrings and whatnot. But interestingly enough, whatever prevented the Assyrians from doing to the southern kingdom exactly what they'd done to the north, appears to have been recognized across the board by Israelites, Egyptians, Assyrians as some sort of divine retribution, divine smite, as it were. Meanwhile, as I recall, there's trouble on the home front. Whenever the king's away, the generals will play. And the Assyrian army lifts the siege, runs back home to Assyria, and Judah is spared. The southern kingdom sallies on. All right, so there are a bunch of kings in Judah. The good news is they're all descended from the Davidic line. There's only one royal house. Even if, cousins kill each other, they're all descended from David, unlike the north where it was a free-for-all, might makes right. But even so, most of the kings of Judah, the biblical authors are clear, are just terrible. And the worst of the worst, the most hated and cursed, was King Manasseh. King Manasseh is just the worst. And we read about him in 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 through 16. And again, the hallmarks of a terrible, terrible, terrible king is that he doesn't give a flying fig for the covenants of his ancestors. He does not care about God, and he sheds innocent blood. These all go together to make a bad king. However, it wasn't all terrible. There was a good king or two. In 2 Kings chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, chapter 23, verses 1 to 3, and 24 to 27, we encounter Josiah. And if Manasseh is just the worst, Josiah is simply the best. Certainly the best since David, and we saw what a mixed bag David was. Josiah is faithful, pious, he keeps God ever in mind, he takes care of the poor, the widow, the orphan. He's a good guy. Still dies violently in battle, but Josiah was a good king, probably the best king Judah ever had, at least since David, centuries earlier. Then we go back to a bad king. The good doesn't last long. 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 36, and reading on to chapter 24, verse 4, we meet Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim is, in many ways, your run-of-the-mill cruddy king. I mean, he's awful, he's terrible, he's evil, he's wicked, but so were most of his ancestors. What sets Jehoiakim apart is that he is the first to face the new big bad on the block, which is the Babylonian Empire, technically the Neo-Babylonian Empire of the Chaldeans, but the Bible doesn't go into all of that. Basically, the Babylonians are even bigger and stronger and tougher than the Assyrians. In fact, they're the ones who took out Assyria. I'm going to be talking about three big empires in the Old Testament, and I remember them by ABC. Assyrians, Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great of Persia and the Medes. Granted that last one's cheating a little bit, but Assyria, Babylonia, Cyrus. And the Babylonians come. The Assyrians were scary. The Babylonians eat them up. They're even scarier. And they come and they make war against Judah. Why? Again, the wickedness of kings, straying from the grace and mercy and protection of God. And Judah survives, but ends up becoming a vassal of the Babylonians. So finally, we come to the year 586 BC. We've covered about 400 years in the last 24 minutes. So, props to you for sticking through this long. And we come to Zedekiah. Z is for Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. Zedekiah makes the mistake of telling the Babylonians he'll be a good boy, he'll be a good vassal, and then going and trying to make a secret or not so secret alliance with Egypt to get away from the Babylonians. He's playing two great empires off against each other, and it comes back to bite him in the bum. The Babylonians come in, they attack Judah, they besiege Jerusalem, and just as, the kingdom split in 922 BC, the north fell in 722 BC, now we're at 586 BC, And in many ways, it's a repeat of history, right? Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And the Babylonians take the movers and shakers of Judah, the southern kingdom, off into exile, the same way that the Assyrians had done that with the kingdom in the north. And the kingdom in the north, well, it was never the same again, really. It was this mix of Israelite and these five pagan nations with a little bit of Yahweh worship and a little bit of worshiping these five lords of the five imported peoples known as the Baals, the five Baals in the north. My point is that the north was broken beyond repair, and now it looks like the south shall suffer the same fate. Zedekiah, the last thing he ever sees is his sons being murdered. And after they show him that, they cut out his eyes. And they lead Zedekiah off into exile in Babylon with all of the priests and the prophets and the soldiers and the movers and the shakers. And those who are left behind are the poor. The meek inherit the earth, as it were. The Babylonians don't take away every soul. Who's going to farm? What a waste of land that would be. They take away the wealthy and the powerful, and God is left with the poor and the weak in the promised land. And, well, we all know he can work with that, don't we? It seems like the story's done. It seems like the promises given to Abraham and Moses and David are all kaput. The people knew God because they had a temple and a land and a king and a law, and all of that's gone. Temple is destroyed by the Babylonians. They've been taken out of the land. There's no more kings. I just told you how the last one ended his days. And obviously they're not following the law of Moses, because now Babylon is the law of the land. But there's a lot of Bible left to go. And so clearly the story has not ended. And so I will leave you with the northern and southern kingdoms scattered into exile, the great exile, exile with a capital E. And well, we'll pick up there next time. In the meantime, have a blessed Lent. May it be a time when you can find quiet and contemplation and return to the promises of God. For now, go in peace, serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.